Okay, so today we're going to be talking about three different populations. And I have to say, we used to do, when we did the day-long in-person sessions, we had a bunch of special populations all in one day. And it was hard to get everybody covered. And so I was really excited that when we went virtual, we decided to split the special populations into three different sections. And I thought that's going to make this so much easier. So today we're going to look at individuals who experience homelessness, people in the military and veterans, and people involved in the criminal justice system. When I started getting ready to prepare for today, I was like, there still is too much. So we'll do the best we can looking at those particular populations and just paying some special attention. So as always, I ask you to just take a moment to breathe. I think now more than ever, the unusualness of the pandemic, I think, has started to wear on everyone. And so a little moment to just kind of breathe and breathe in some positive things and breathe out some of the negativity. I think could be helpful. When we do talk about special populations, some of you who are with us today have experienced or are part of these special populations. So I'm sure we have some people that have been in the military, some veterans with us today. We may have some people who have experienced homelessness and who have had some involvement in the criminal justice system. So when we talk about those things, sometimes it can touch a spot in us. And so if that happens, I encourage you just to breathe through it and step aside if you need to, because we want to make sure everybody's okay. Quick moment of reflection. I think this is just so important to remember that right now this is not business as usual. We're still in very difficult, different sort of traumatic times. And each of you are responsible for a lot of things, not only yourself and your own families, but also for the people you care for professionally and the people that you work with and just the world at large. That's a lot of responsibility on our shoulders. And so if no one else tells you today that that is appreciated, I want to tell you that everything that you're doing at Presley, at Gateway, in the school districts, at the consumer family satisfaction team, everything that you guys are doing out there in all those places, and even the ones I didn't mention, is really, really appreciated and is continuing to keep us going, which is an important thing. So some of you may have seen this. It's been going around through some social media things, but I thought it really spoke to me, and I think it could speak to some of you. So it says in 2020, therapists have counseled people through a global pandemic, an economic crisis, a politically polarized election, a racial justice movement, chronic uncertainty, anxiety, and depression, with no preparation, warning, or special training, all while they went through the same experiences themselves. If there ever was a time to honor and value therapists, the time is now. And I think that's so true, not just for therapists, but for all the work that we're doing in behavioral health. Look at everything that happened in 2020. We didn't have any warning or training to deal with that. And we had to just move forward. And so this is a good time to honor yourselves and to remember the value of the work that you do. So as I always talk about with the pandemic, and we're moving around it in this now more, I think, but so think about this in terms not just of the pandemic, but also in light of what's happening in our government, and in our social environment. There is a lot of grief that's going on for each of us, that things are just not the same way that they were a year ago. Today is January, I forget the date. Today is January 13th, and it is very different than it was January 13th of 2019, of 2020, definitely of 2019. So think about the stages of grief. It's not very fluid and sometimes really simple and pretty like it looks like in some graphs. This is the one that always captures my attention because it's kind of chaotic. And I think that's how grief really is. So think about yourself Think about these areas that you may be experiencing of denial or isolation, anger. That's the one that's been getting me a little bit lately. Depression, bargaining, acceptance. Notice how you're going back and forth, and then really think about that and even educate your clients about that, that there's some normalcy to that. With us never having been through this type of situation, people are questioning our own responses. Are we responding like we should be? Are we responding like normal? And so I think that's important to normalize that for clients as well as others, as well as ourselves. So we've talked about this. This slide I've shown at every presentation we've done in this series so far virtually, but I did change the little picture, and it's a little fuzzy, I think, but it's a little kitten, and then behind him is the lion that's roaring, and I kind of see that that's what we're coming to. So we've never been through a crisis like this. It's not normal. It's unreliable. There's so much uncertainty and needs that are struggling. People are struggling to meet their needs. But I also feel that even though we're some of us are that little kitten, there is that lion behind us that is coming out and has been coming out and representing that, kind of power, and that we are resilient and we are continuing to push through. I do think what's important to remember about the clientele that we work with is that everything that's been happening with the government and with social justice and with the pandemic, all that is hard and difficult for every single person to manage. It's more difficult for people that have a history with mental health issues, substance issues, or trauma histories. I was listening to a webinar yesterday about risk management during the pandemic for behavioral health folks. And one of the topics was about the workplace, how to handle employees, what employees need, and what you can do and can't do with employees during the pandemic. I didn't say that very well when I said handle employees. That's not what I meant. But one of the things that the gentleman was saying is that before the pandemic, there were a number of people who had issues with mental health or issues possibly with substance use or co-occurring issues, but they didn't necessarily need accommodations in the workplace through the ADA. They were able to manage that on their own. And now the pandemic has kind of pushed some people into a place where maybe now they do need accommodations, which are required through the ADA. And so he was cautioning us not to think, well, he didn't need this before, so why does he need this now? Well, we have to remember that everything that's going on in the world right now is exacerbating a lot of things for a lot of people. So people who were able to handle things more on their own previously may not be able to as much now. And we just want to remember that. So I thought that was an interesting topic, and think about it with the people that you're working with. So this graph just talks about the different ways that everything is affecting mental health and what that's causing as far as mental health. So over on the left, we have things like lack of infectious disease knowledge and lack of health behaviors, where people just still have uncertainty about the COVID. And I know now the vaccine is available to some, and there's lots of uncertainty about that. Lack of mental health assessment and self-judgment methods. There's economic problems, lots of reported problems with sleep and nutrition, and then concentration. All that impacts mental health, right? Everything that's going on with COVID-19 is impacting mental health. And then all the things on the right, the changes and our ability to have to adapt, lack of coping skills for this specific event, the impact of social media and the news media and those types of things, quarantining, isolation, fear and anxiety for the health of the family, that all contributes to mental health. And then, of course, that all contributes to anxiety and depression and stress. So just lots of things going on. So today what we want to focus on is we're going to talk about these three particular populations, and we want to remember that there's no particular look to it. People don't walk into our office and we say, oh, yeah, clearly he's co-occurring. It's a process that we learn. And to remember, too, that when we do identify that someone has co-occurring issues, that is not all that they are. And we want to make sure that we're really conscientious to not label someone as that's what they are, as co-occur. They just are co-occurring. Those are pieces of them. And that's important for us to recognize. When we're going through the special populations today, I really want you to think in context of everything that we've learned about mental health and substance abuse with co-occurring folks. And then we're going to add this other layer on top. When you're dealing with people who have mental health issues or substance use issues, that's complicated, right? When someone's dealing with both, it gets more complicated. And then when you add some of these other special criteria in there, it can add even more complication to it. So we want to really be aware and think in context of that as we're going through today. Today, we're going to talk about individuals who have experienced homelessness, individuals who have been in the military, including veterans, and individuals who experience criminal justice, the criminal justice system. And some of those are going to overlap. So as we talk through these three populations of people, you know, there is a connection between people involved in the criminal justice system and homelessness. There is a connection between people that come back from the military and our veterans and homelessness. There's a connection between people who've been involved in the military and our veterans who are also involved in the criminal justice system. So all these things are going to kind of overlap, and we just want to just really be aware of that as we go. So homelessness, I want to be conscientious. And when we titled our session today, I think it's called A Look at Special Populations, Homeless. I forget what it's called. Anyway, I want us to try to get away from, and I made this error, from calling people homeless. Like that really puts something on them that kind of identifies or labels them and isn't necessarily accurate. So we want to remember that homelessness is not something that defines an individual. It is something that more than likely is for a temporary period of time. It's not a fixed period of time. People usually are not homeless forever, although we do have some chronic homelessness that we're going to talk about a little bit. But homelessness is usually a temporary problem in someone's life, and it's not a part of their identity necessary. So we want to watch our language, and we want to just think that through when we're thinking about how we refer to people that are dealing with homelessness. This was a really great article I read called 6 Things I Want You to Understand About Being Homeless in America. And I think some of these things will really touch base if we think about them. Sometimes I think when it comes to homelessness issues, we try not to think about it because it's really hard. But we live in a system that makes it extremely difficult to get out of homelessness. So I say that people are usually involved in homelessness is temporary. That doesn't necessarily mean it's short-lived. And once people are homeless, it's hard to get out of that. That's just the way our system is designed, unfortunately. And so keep that in mind when you're working with people who are struggling with homelessness. And remember, too, when we talk about homelessness, we're not just talking about people who don't have a place to live have a home. We're also talking about people who have unstable housing, who aren't sure how they're going to continue to pay for where they're going to live. Those types of issues. So we have a lot of, it encompasses a lot when we talk about the homelessness experience. But I think getting out of homelessness is kind of like getting a job. You know, my mother always said it's easier to get a job when you have a job. Well, it's easier to move into a new home when you have a home. And so I think that's important for us to remember that this is not an easy task, the way our system is set up, designed to get people moving forward. Number 2 says hunger is such a small part of the problem. So actually, if you think about the resources that we have in our country and in our county, most people are able to get food if they need to from some source or another. And if you even think about people who see homeless people in the street, you know, people who they tend to give them food. I don't want to minimize that's an issue, but it's just a small part of what the problem is when people are dealing with homelessness. This was a quote from the woman who wrote this, and she said that no one in their right mind chooses to be homeless. And I think that's important. You know, we hear that with the stigma sometimes when people see people panhandling, or I've noticed recently, well, maybe not so recently because it's cold and I haven't been anywhere, but the last time I was really up in the Robinson Township area when it was not quite so cold, I was surprised that there were several people on different corners there with signs and, you know, need food, need a job, need a home, those types of things. And there's a stigma around that those people are willingly there. But I think it is important to remember that nobody really chooses to be homeless, so to speak. Now, out in the other side of the country, there's a relatively big homeless population of people that choose to be that. And I have a friend who decided, and we haven't heard from him in years, which scares me, so he may no longer be with us, but he had a lot of substance use issues, a lot of mental health issues, and he chose to go to California and live a homeless lifestyle. That just seemed to suit him, and it's cool, warmer out there, so that wasn't much of an issue. So when this person says no one in their right mind chooses to be homeless, I guess we have to put some parameters around that when we think about it. People who are homeless are not lazy, crazy, drug addicts that can't be helped. So I think that's important to remember too, that just because someone is homeless doesn't mean that any of these other things are true. This one I thought was really potent, and when I really think about it, it scares me. But homelessness can happen to anyone. And so any one of us, you know, we're pretty privileged, and that if we have a stable home to live in, whether we own it or rent it or live with someone or whatever. But things could change, as we've noticed in the world in 2020 quickly, and that could be removed from us. And so she also says, if you really want to help the person next time you see a homeless person, don't just hand them things. And what she goes on to talk about in this article is to really talk to people who are experiencing homelessness and see what it is that they need. You know, my daughter will tell you this experience. She hated it, but she and I went to Cleveland. I know, Cleveland. How about that game? Anyway, my daughter and I went to Cleveland a few years ago to see a concert. We went to see this band called Rainbow Kitten Surprise. They're actually really good, despite the name. And while we were in Cleveland, this gentleman who seemed to be homeless was asking people for money. And so he asked us for money. And so I started asking him questions. I said, you know, where are you going to stay tonight? And at first he was kind of apprehensive, and then he and I started talking, and he said that he has stayed at a shelter sometimes. He wasn't sure where he was going to stay that night. And then he said, well, you know, when I do stay at the shelter, then sometimes these good things happen to me. And he said that one time I was able to stay at the shelter and get into rehab. And he started talking about maybe he might do something different now. And then my daughter and I did give him some money, which he promised me he'd use for food. We shall see. We'll never know, actually. But my daughter was kind of horrified by the whole thing, that I would talk to strangers. But, you know, that gentleman, and the lesson I wanted her to learn, which I think she did, is he's still a person. He's not in the best place where he'd like to be. And in talking with him, you know, I'd like to think, because I'm the eternal optimist, that maybe something was said there that did push him forward, maybe a tiny little seed. Maybe he did go to the shelter that night. Maybe he did get himself into rehab. Maybe he did move forward. I don't by any means think that, you know, I can go out and save the world like that by myself, but little seeds that everybody can plant. And I think the important part to this is to really recognize that people who are dealing with homelessness, they're people just like us. So we want to treat them as such and make sure that they're being respected. Oops. And so I saw this picture and I thought that this captured a little bit of what we were talking about, and something to remember, that once I was like you. and that could happen to any of us. So let's look at some of the numbers and what all we're looking at when it comes to homelessness. There we go. Okay. Hello? Wasn't sure if someone had a question or. So this talks about people experiencing homelessness on any given night in 2019, and it's broken down into a couple different categories. So on any given night, there were overall 567,715 individuals identified as being homeless on that night, on any given night. I suspect these numbers are low because sometimes it is hard to capture the number of people that are dealing with or experiencing homelessness in any particular moment. 396,000 of them were individuals, 171,000 of those were people living in families, 96,000 were chronically homeless, and 37,000 were veterans. So remember, we talked about that crossover of different people, different populations we're going to talk about today. So 37,000 were veterans, 35,000 were unaccompanied youth, which is the definition of the unaccompanied youth would be under the age of 25 without a parent or a family member. And then the little graphs below show you who was sheltered and who was not sheltered. So most of the people in families were sheltered. Most of the unaccompanied youth, or at least half of them, were not sheltered on any given night. And although it looks like our veterans, a little more of them were sheltered, not much more than half. And many of our chronically homeless individuals were not. So that's definitely something to just to think about the severity. You know, I live in Beaver, and I always think that Beaver people think that nothing bad happens in Beaver, and we couldn't possibly have a homelessness in Beaver, but we do, and we can see it sometimes, and most of the times we don't see it, or we probably ignore it. But we do have homelessness that's pretty significant in Beaver County, and even in my little town of Beaver. So to continue to look at the numbers, most, I guess I should have labeled that, but the number, the 343,187, those are males, and 219,911, those are females. So most of the homeless population that we're looking at in our country in 2019 were which actually, let me back up to that, which actually connects to that part where we talk about families. When we looked at that one graph, it said that a lot of families were sheltered. Just by culture, historically, women tend to keep their children with them, and men don't always do that. So it makes a little more sense that men may not, that there might be more men out there that don't have a stable place. So by ethnicity, we're looking at primarily white people, but Black people come in just very closely behind that. And so statistically, that doesn't necessarily add up, right? And then, I didn't do a good job of, I cut off some of my my words over there. But we're looking at Latinos, 124,000, multiracial, 36,000. This would be Native American, 17,000, Pacific Islander, and Asian. So it just gives you an idea of ethnicity. So when we talk about homelessness, you know, we talk about how we're dealing with people with co-occurring disorders, and that's complicated. And then now we're talking about people with co-occurring disorders who also deal with homelessness, more complicated. There are a couple little groups in there that make it even more complicated. One would be that chronically homeless group of people. These are usually people who have disabilities. They experience either long-term or repeated episodes of homelessness. And that's about 17% of the homeless population. Our veterans are about 7%, and that unaccompanied youth under 25 years old is 6%. Because of COVID-19, we've had some even more complications, right? So according to the CDC, they say that individuals that are 65 and older are at a higher risk of becoming seriously ill from COVID-19. So think about that for a second. People 65 and over are at higher risk for to become really sick with COVID if they were to get it. People that are experiencing homelessness, they have studied, actually age faster than people who have stable housing. So research indicates that physical conditions that mirror those people of 15 to 20 years older than them. So a 50-year-old would potentially respond to COVID-19 the same as, so a 50-year-old that has chronic homelessness or deals with homelessness could potentially experience COVID the same way as a 65-year-old who has stable housing. And on any single day, there's about over 202,000, single adults that experience homelessness that are over the age of 50. And so that's a real issue when we're dealing with COVID. First of all, people who are dealing with homelessness, particularly unsheltered, may not have the resources or the knowledge to protect themselves against COVID-19. And then they're more apt to respond to it and become particularly sick. There's also an issue about pre-existing conditions. So we know that people who have pre-existing conditions potentially have a higher risk of becoming more ill if they get COVID-19. And people in dealing with homelessness tend to underestimate their pre-existing conditions or not even be aware of that. So in this particular study, they found 84% of people in our country said that they have pre-existing conditions, like myself, but only 19% of people in the shelter said the same thing. And part of that is just because it's not a priority to them, because they're moving forward trying to look at other issues. And part of it is they're probably just not aware because they haven't had the services of healthcare in the way that people who don't deal with homelessness have had. But that puts them at another risk, at a higher risk again, if they were to contract COVID-19, that they could become particularly sick. So those are some extra things we have to look at currently. Things like self-quarantine, social isolation, stay-at-home orders, those are difficult if you don't actually have a home. Like, where do you self-quarantine if you don't have a home? How do you socially isolate? How do you stay at home when the government tells you to stay at home if you don't have a home to stay in? So research has shown that the number of COVID-19 cases are rising amongst our people that are dealing with homelessness. And unfortunately, our levels of homelessness are increasing because of COVID-19. And these are some of the cities. Luckily, Pittsburgh and the surrounding areas were not named here, but these are the areas that are experiencing that the most. Doesn't mean we won't experience some of it, though. So when you think about what triggers homelessness and how we talked about how it could happen to anyone, what triggers that? So the number one reason is usually some sort of loss of job. And so we know during COVID-19, that's pretty significant right now, that there are a number of people that are losing their jobs or their jobs are changing and things like that are happening. So that increases the risk of homelessness right now. Bills, not having enough money to pay the bills that you need to pay, being kicked out by a family member. So think about a lot of the people that we work with who maybe are dealing with substance use and the families finally say you can't live here anymore unless you go to rehab. And they don't want to go to rehab, so then they're out. Abuse at home, so that's a significant issue. And when we talk about homelessness and unstable housing, abuse in a home can certainly cause that to happen. So incarceration, being sick or disabled or having mental disabilities. So if you think about COVID-19, there are a lot of protections to keep people from losing their jobs, from losing their homes and things like that if they get COVID, but it's still a pretty real fear for many, many people. Changes in family status, certainly drug and alcohol. So these are the main things. So if you think about, how homelessness could happen to any of us, could these things happen to any of us? Could something happen to our jobs? Could something happen to us financially? could something happen, change our family status as far as what our families look like, or if abuse were to start, or someone were incarcerated, things like that. And then it's easier to recognize that this could happen to any of us. So things to think about when we're dealing with people who have co-occurring disorders and are dealing with homelessness, or have a history of dealing with homelessness. You may have a client who comes to you now and they're stable as far as housing is concerned, but if there is a history there, we don't want to overlook that, because it adds to a lot of things. But we want to remember that when we're dealing with people who experience homelessness, there's a large increased risk of medical problems that don't get addressed. Frequently, they're living and they're frequent victims and living in areas where there's a lot of crime. And we have a disproportionate use of substances and mental illness when we're dealing with the homeless population. So the numbers, so 82 to up to 168,000 people who are experiencing homelessness in any given week also have co-occurring disorders. So that's important to recognize. Most of them identify substance use as the primary reason for not being able to stabilize housing. 86% of alcohol problems, 60% report illicit drugs. And important to note here, we've said this before, but I don't think we have the final numbers from 2019 yet, or I'm sorry, from 2020 yet, but we do know that the numbers of overdose deaths in Beaver County in 2020 were higher than they were the previous year. And a lot of that is the complications that COVID have added to what's going on. So why is this important? So now we know a little bit about how people become homeless and what it looks like, what those numbers are. Why is it important for us to address homelessness when we're dealing with people who have COD? Well, so some of the studies have shown some really powerful things. For example, one study said that a positive change in stable housing measure represented a 40-day increase in the time of recovery. So if you're working with someone who can barely get a couple of days, if that, sober, if they had some more stable housing, then if they could possibly get an increase of 40 days of recovery. That would be amazing. That would be amazing, right? Psychiatric hospital stays were reduced by 28 days for each placement in supportive housing. So that's pretty significant. And those who received extra vocational housing services achieved even longer periods of abstinence than those who did not. So, these are what we refer to these as those non-treatment needs, but they are sometimes just as important, or maybe even more important sometimes than treatment, is being able to provide people with a safe place to live and a stable place. And then that allows them to be able to do some of the work in the head and in the heart on their own. And we're built for that. We're pretty resilient people. I think we have to remember that. But if our environment is really chaotic, it is difficult for people to sometimes focus and take care of the things that we need to take care of. So providing that good housing environment can lend a lot of really positive support. And then some of the important things that we want to remember, that we want to teach patients who have experienced homelessness, is how they get housing, how they maintain housing. And then we want to work closely with people that are dealing, like the Cornerstone of Beaver County, who are dealing primarily with homelessness issues, because it's something that we don't always know the details of. Like, we don't know all the programs that are available. We don't know what all qualifies and those types of things. And so, but we want to be able to teach some of those skills to the people that we work with. And then I want to tell a little story too about years ago at the Rudder House. The halfway house for men, which breaks my heart. That's still sits there empty. But at the Rudder House years ago, we had a bunch of blankets donated from this hotel up in Moon, and more blankets that we could handle than we needed. And so the men came up with this idea that they wanted to go out and give these blankets to people who were homeless. And so we gathered up in the van and we went down into Aliquippa. It was, you know, we're talking 10 years ago probably, but whatever year it was, we were having the coldest day of the year in like 50 years or something. I don't remember. It was something dramatic. And so the gentleman and I get pile in the van, and we drive through Aliquippa, and we're looking for people who may need blankets, and we didn't find anybody. And that really spoke to me about the invisibility of our homeless population, and how then it makes it easy for us to kind of pretend like it's not there. What we ended up doing was going to the police station, and I still have to laugh to this day, because two of the brothers, the Rutter brothers, went in and said to took these blankets in and said to the police officers, we have all these blankets, we'd like, we want to give them to homeless people. We didn't find any. Maybe you would, run into someone that could use them. And of course they say on them, property of whatever hotel it was. And so then the police, I think, thought they stole them. And so they came out to talk to me, and I was like, I swear it's all legit. These are not stolen blankets. But I think that really spoke to me that day about how invisible, and think about it, it was the coldest day of the year. You would hope that people would not be outside. You would hope that people had gotten to a shelter or found someplace at least to stay warm. And, so it was kind of silly for us to think that we were going to see people out and about on that particular day. We also need to, when we're dealing with people who have histories with homelessness, look at real life issues that impact housing. So legal and pending criminal justice issues. Think about people who are on Megan's list or sexual offenders. Much more difficult for them to find housing than it is for the rest of the world. Other legal issues that may be draining on them financially because of lawyers and fines and things like that. Those can be real issues that clients sometimes need help figuring out what the resources are and figuring out a plan of how to address those things. Social Security, disability, other benefits that people may be available for, that may be available to people that sometimes people aren't even aware of. So that's an important thing to really help connect them to the resources. And again, remember, when we're dealing with co-occurring to clients, we don't have to be the experts on everything. What we do have to be is we do have to know where the resources are. But we also want to help people make sure we're looking at issues that are related to children. So if I'm a parent and I'm dealing with homelessness, that affects my children. That affects my children if they're with me, living with me, and it affects my children if they're not living with me in different ways. So we want to definitely look at those issues. If someone's dealing with homelessness, what are their, and they have children, what happens to the children with school? We do have children enrolled in our public schools in Beaver County who are listed as homeless, and that, we make accommodations for that. Now, what happens during COVID when the schools close down and kids have to do virtual school from home and there is no home? That becomes really complicated, and I don't even know what's happening with that right about now with COVID and what's going on with that. But that's a tough one. And then healthcare issues. So remember, we've talked about people who are experiencing homelessness don't have the resources or aren't able or willing to be able to focus on their health as much as the rest of us can. So being able to really help them take a look at that, because, the body tells the story of what's going on in the head. So sometimes we have physical health issues that are coming from the mental health problems that we have. And we want to handle both of those kind of together. So really being able to make sure we become kind of experts in how to handle those non-treatment needs that are actually very much treatment oriented. So I see Kristen actually has an answer for us here. She said, many families keep homelessness information secret or private, and that does impact schooling. It does help when schools know about the homelessness. Thanks, Kristen, for that. That is very, very true. And again, think about the stigma that's connected with homelessness. And particularly if you're a parent. It's one thing if I'm an individual, I'm an adult, and I have a stigma of homelessness. That's one thing. But now I'm a mom, and I have kids and we're homeless, that's a whole different ballgame. And there's also some fear, I'm sure, around what would happen. What will the school do if they find out that we're homeless? Would they do something bad? Would they take my kids away from me? So I'm sure there's lots of motivation of why people keep that information kind of secret. But it keeps us from giving them the resources that could help move them forward. Yeah, Tristan was saying about the fear there. That's very, very true. So there are a couple things. Let me see. I have to stop sharing my screen and then come back. There's two things that we're making available to you today. Okay, this is the first one, and I'm not sure if Jen's going to send them out to you. We'll let you know later. She's either going to send them out to you later when she sends your certificates, or maybe maybe she's able to make them available some other way. I'm not sure, but these are Beaver County housing resources. The last time that we did this presentation about homelessness, I had put together a list of different counties and different agencies for each county, and I got a lot of feedback that some of it was wrong. So don't believe everything you read on the internet is the lesson there. But what I did here was went and stayed more local to our county. And there are a number of different resources at different levels. So this talks about the crisis line, which is available 24/7, the crisis text line. There's the CARES Rent Relief Program, currently available now. The Housing Authority of Beaver County, the Cornerstone, that should say, of Beaver County, which is a fantastic program, Habitat for Humanity. And then these are some other resources that can help. The City Rescue Mission in Newcastle, the Women's Center, Beaver County, Franklin Center, Catholic Charities, American Red Cross, and Salvation. And these are all Salvation Army. Those are all the local numbers. So you guys can just have some resources that you can give when you need to.
Hey, Jill.
Yes.
Hi, this is Marcy from Cornerstone Recovery and Support.
Hi, Marcy.
Hi. I wanted to ask if you could add us to that list. I think we're like Beaver County's best kept.
You are. Why did I not add you to that list?
We do have a housing specialist who primarily works with people experiencing homelessness. That's what her job is. So, and she works very closely with the Cornerstone also, who are awesome. But then we also have an apartment program for people experiencing homelessness, occurring substance use disorders, legal history, and mental health issues. Yeah.
Marcy, can you put in the chat, can you put your contact information?
Sure.
And then I'll make sure that I add to the list for the next time. And it looks like Jen has already sent out those handouts. So I will make sure. I don't know why. How did I do that, Marcy?
I think just because I'm
blame it on COVID brain. That's what it is. Okay, so I have one more resource I want to share with you. And can you guys see that? Jen, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the Cornerstone of Beaver County, and this talks about some of the programs that they have there. And so I just wanted to make sure that that was available to you as well. Okay. Give me a second here. You know how I am dealing with technology. I'm not always good. Okay, resume the slideshow. Okay. Other questions or comments, or Marcy, I really appreciate you adding that. Questions or comments about dealing with this particular population around homelessness before we move on? And again, there's so much more to talk about. It's just we just have limited amount of
time. Jill, I was going to ask you, this is Paul.
Hi, Paul.
I was going to ask you about Habitat for Humanity. During COVID, are they taking like any volunteers or anything like that?
Well, that's a good question. when I checked the website, because I wanted to make sure what I put on my list was active, everything looks to, I mean, they do have some things in place, I'm sure, but they didn't have anything online that said that they weren't taking volunteers.
Okay.
I'm sure, like the rest of the world, there are some difficulties there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
They also have the Habitat for Humanity also has the Restore over in, I'm not sure, is that Beaver Falls or is that New Brighton? But it's right where those two connect, called the Restore, where they take donations and sell donations,
Oh, okay.
things like that.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
up and running, but I'm not sure, they might be taking people in by appointment only. I'm not sure how they're handling that, or maybe they're following the guidelines of a retail store.
Okay.
But those are good questions. I apologize, I don't have those answers for you.
Okay. Thank you anyways. Thank you.
If any of you are looking for something in 2021 to be your focus as far as volunteer work or giving contributions, things like that, I would really say that housing, I mean, I'm definitely focused on mental health myself, but housing is that one thing that can really put someone over the edge in a good way or a bad way. And so if you're looking for something to champion, then dealing with issues of homelessness might be something you want to think about this year.
Hi, Jill, it's Marcy again.
Yes, Marcy.
I just wanted to share a little bit more information. So in the next couple weeks, Beaver County will be conducting their point in time surveys, which is done across the country. And that's where we do it sounds terrible to say it this way, but a count of people experiencing homelessness. And the reason it's so important is that this count then goes to the government, which determines how much funding comes to an area to help eliminate homelessness. So if anybody knows of anyone that's experiencing homelessness, I would say just reach out to the Cornerstone, because they're sort of spearheading it, and they can connect with that person to get the information. Normally we had outreach teams and we spent, a couple days out in the community everywhere, but of course with COVID, we're not doing that. So they're doing most things over the phone, or there's, one or two people who have been selected to meet face-to-face with people experiencing homelessness to give that information. So again, if you know of anyone experiencing homelessness, have them reach out to the Cornerstone of Beaver County, and we can get some of that data, which helps us get more funding to this county. And the other thing I wanted to add is just every year on December 21st, we hold a memorial for anyone who has died while homeless in Beaver County. December 21st, as you know, is the longest night of the year and the winter solstice. So that's why that night was chosen. And this was, I think, the 35th anniversary for the National Homeless Memorial. But we do that every year in Beaver County as well. So come this time next year, unfortunately, we had quite a few names this year. We've had a couple years where we had no names, which was wonderful. But we generally advertise it. So if people want to participate, we'd love to have you there. Again, it gets kind of the information out there and gets services out there and helps people. So thank you.
Thank you, Marcy. Wow. I bet that's really powerful.
It is. This year we did it. We did it through a Zoom meeting, but then we live streamed it on Facebook. So it was, and people, we all had candles at home and turned out our lights. So it was just very beautiful and very sad that we had so many names this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Marcy, I have a couple of quick questions since we have you here as our expert on homelessness issues. In the past year in 2020, have the people that have come to you for services, does it look different?
I mean, I feel like I kind of want to say no in terms of, there's the moratorium on evictions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's helped some people maintain and keep their housing through COVID. at the same time, it has presented some challenges in that, there's times when Governor Wolf has kind of shut down different services. So then at those times, in order to keep our employees safe, we don't do any face-to-face meetings.
Right.
So, for a few weeks, every couple months, it seems like we have this little bit of a shutdown. Other than that, then, our agency, the Cornerstone, other agencies that support people experiencing homelessness open back up and then start back with the face-to-face. And everyone's been able to do it, I think, pretty safely in terms of helping people be safe, taking temperatures, wearing masks, social distancing while we meet with people. Certainly in the summer and spring and early fall, that was easy to do outside.
Right. What about the Shell plant with the the influx of people coming from different areas into Beaver County? Has that impacted in the last couple of years at all?
Well, so the impact with that was that it took away a lot of housing. Landlords, especially private landlords who were, they could make a lot more money by renting to someone from the Shell plant. So we did find for a little while that rents went up quite a bit, and that we had less apartments available to us for people who are experiencing homelessness and may have low income. So that made things a little more challenging. That's sort of opening back up again. And of course, we have a kind of a core of wonderful landlords who specifically work with these various agencies to help people experiencing homelessness, and really just work with that population. So that is also like just a really wonderful thing that happens in Beaver County.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know recently one of my clients is separated and he needs to find a place to live. So he called a place that he lived before, just I think maybe 5 years ago, and it was a house that he had rented that was reasonable. And he called now, and the landlord said, "Oh, we don't rent for that anymore."
Yes.
So it's they don't have to. But now we don't have too much longer. What would we have, another year maybe with the Shell plant of the construction?
I think so. Yeah, that sounds about
And
right.
then those numbers of employees there are going to go way down. And so we'll see a change again.
Yes, and when they shut down for a while, a lot of those people who were here from out of state went back home and did not come back.
Yeah.
So that did open up a few more opportunities for housing.
Excellent. Marcy, thank you so much. I appreciate everything you're sharing with us.
Thank you for allowing me.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else have any questions or comments they want to make about homelessness issues?
No, Jill, there was a question in the comments or the chat.
Okay.
Marcy could probably also answer.
You know what? I can't see my chat right now. Could you read the question?
Tracy Manorino wants to know the difference between the Cornerstone Resources and Cornerstone Recovery and Supports.
That's an excellent question.
Yes, and it's a very common question, especially because we're all located just a couple blocks from each other.
Right.
And we work so closely together. We often are intertwined. So the cornerstone of Beaver County connects people to resources on multiple levels. They have special programs for veterans, obviously for people experiencing homelessness and mental health issues. They also run coordinated entry, which is the system that anyone experiencing homelessness can go through that evaluation and then become eligible for some of the HUD-funded programs that are in Beaver County. So that's all done through the Cornerstone. They also can help connect you to resources for help with rent, with furniture, with food, those kinds of things. And that's that's like a quick explanation of what they do. And then, so where we're a little bit different is that we have a housing specialist that actually functions as a case manager for people. If someone comes in experiencing homelessness, then they work closely with them to get them housed, to help them find housing, and have a lot of connections with landlords and the housing authority sometimes to help when things are denied. They can help with the appeal process. And then, like I said, a lot of contacts with landlords who private landlords who rent for a reasonable rate. And then we also have the HUD funded program. So we actually provide the housing as well as helping people connect to the housing.
Marcy, thanks. Does that hopefully that clarifies things for everybody a little bit. And I'm making myself a note because I want to add you guys as soon as we're done with today. I want to add it so I know it's ready for next time. So I'm making myself a little note there. Okay, if nothing else, we're going to move on. We're going to start to talk about military
Jill,
veterans, and then we are going to end up taking a break probably in the middle of that. But
Jill.
Yes.
Yes, I was just going to say, it's just a comment about homelessness. I remember talking to a person when I was still working at Brighton Rehab, the LTSR, about his homelessness and everything like that. And I kind of realized that, you know, for a person with a mental illness, and he also had substance abuse issues, you know, I guess the difficulty was, of course, staying off the drugs, but also not just that, but having the responsibility of paying bills, of cooking, of cleaning, of, you know, doing normal things that we all do when we do have a home, and having a mental illness on top of it. So it was, I got I guess in close encounter with homeless. I mean his total, I mean, he was just talking to me like, you know, anybody would talk, but I totally understood what he was saying, because you know, I mean, I never experienced homelessness for myself, but I experienced the difficulty of, you know, of course, you know, you know, I do pay my bills, all my bills and everything like that. I'm learning how to cook, you know. So, I mean, there's a lot of responsibilities that go with life in general that these people are dealing with. And it's hard for them to put them all into order and to have like a kind of like a, kind of like a, what's the word that I want to use? You know, repetition and everything like that, that you would do it on a normal daily basis.
Yeah, like a routine.
A routine, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
That's a good points, Paul. Thanks for that. You know, that's one of the things that when we talk about working with clients, not only helping them to get housing, but to maintain it. And you know, there is a lot of responsibility that comes with owning a home. You know, I was sharing with Jen before we started this little suite where we have our office. I lease, and I have thought about buying it. And I think, well, if I bought it, my monthly payment would be less than my lease payment. But when this water pipe broke underground, I'd be paying for that. So there are different responsibilities that come with learning how to maintain a home. There's a gentleman I've worked with. I've shared his story a little bit in other sessions we've had. He was a hoarder and lost his home, and was going to kill himself. And he was very clear that if he lost his home, he was going to kill himself. And we ended up, I did a wellness check one day with the police, and we did get him to go to the hospital. And recently he came back and shared with me that had that not happened, he would have killed himself because he had lost the house. And now he had resources as far as family is concerned. So it wasn't that he had, he wasn't going to be homeless, but he was losing that particular house. So now he's in this little apartment, and he's unfortunately starting to do some of the same patterns that he did in the house. And so some of those hoarding behaviors and those behaviors of not having a routine to keep the house, to keep the apartment cared for are coming back into play. And he and I are trying to address those, and his family trying to help him address those things too, because he just, for whatever reason, doesn't have the skills to yet to maintain a home. So that, and it's more complicated than that, but that's part of it. So I think that's a very good point. Good point there, Paul. Okay, so we're going to move on because we want to talk about military and veterans, and there's a lot of information here. So we're going to start to get through some of it, and then we are going to take a short break. So let's look at the numbers first. So these are the number of active and reserve U.S. military from 2019. And so that just gives you an idea of the largest is Army active duty, and the smallest would be the Coast Guard Reserve. We also have, when we talk about military, we also want to talk about their families, because their families are certainly impacted by their profession. So approximately 2 million military children have experienced a parental employment since 2001. There are currently 1.2 million military children of active duty members worldwide. About 80% of the military children go to public schools. So that's an important thing for us to remember when we're looking at the school districts. And the average military family moves 3 times more often than the civilian counterparts. So just think about when you're dealing with kids, if they're coming from military families, they're going to experience some things a little bit differently than otherwise. These are the numbers of veterans through the Census Bureau. So the number of veterans in the United States declined by about 1/3 between 2000 and 2018. So we're certainly losing a number of our veterans. Fewer than 500,000 World War II veterans were alive in 2018. And women make up a growing share of veterans, about 1.7 million or 9% in 2018. And that's projected to jump to about 17% by 2040, which is in 20 years. Doesn't that sound weird? 2040 to me is like 1999 was, when Prince sang the song. It seemed like it was so far away, but it'll be here tomorrow, it seems like. The largest cohort of veterans alive in 2018 were from the Vietnam era, which was from 1964 to 1975. And the second largest of living veterans served during peacetime only. The median age of veterans in 2018 was 65 years old. By service period, post 9/11 veterans were the youngest with a median age of about 37. Vietnam era veterans had a median age of about 71, and World War II veterans were the oldest with a median age about 93. So this gives you an idea of what the population of our veterans look like. So post 9/11 veterans had a 43% chance of having a service-connected disability. So that is higher than veterans from other periods. A lot of that has to do with technology. So in previous wars, this sounds terrible, but our service, our military who went over and fought in wars died. And now we have technology to help keep them alive, but we have a lot of more disabilities, missing limbs, traumatic brain injuries, certainly mental health issues, which we'll talk about. And among the veterans with a service-connected disability, post 9/11 veterans had a 39% chance of having a disability rating of 70% or more. So the disability that we're seeing in our veterans post 9/11 is just more intense and more significant than it was previous to that. Again, part of that is because they're alive. There is a handout that you got that we're not going to review here, but it's a couple pages long. It's called The Structure of the Military. So one of the things I would encourage, if you're going to work with anyone with people who've been involved in the military or with veterans, I would really encourage you to read through and study up on that document. There's a lot of language and lingo that us civilians are just not privy to. And one of the things when you work with people who have military experience that can gain you the most respect quickly is to have a true understanding of what they're talking about. You know, it's certainly okay to say, well, can you explain that to me? I don't understand what your position was, but it's something else to be able to say, I understand what that means. You know, I didn't experience it, but I know what it means. So having, same when you work with first responders, you know, police officers, fire, people for the fire department, EMTs, if you understand the lingo a little bit, then it gives them a much more sense of comfort and gains you a lot of respect quickly. So if you're going to work with some people with military experience, I would encourage you to take a look at that document. So military and veterans, we have a significant issue with trauma. Some of that is because of the involvement they have with combat, or the fear that they could be involved in combat. Some of that is from injuries that they have experienced, repeated deployments or relocations, and then there's a huge issue currently, as we know, with military sexual violence. So when we look at the context of dealing with people with co-occurring disorders who also have a history in the military, then we're looking at that whole extra layer of traumas that can impact them. So here's some just details about how that plays out. Military men were 3.5 times more likely to report frequent heavy drinking compared with women in the military. So that's one thing to keep an eye on. Frequent heavy drinking also varied as a function of ethnicity, with Hispanic and non-Hispanic whites having higher rates of problem drinking than non-Hispanic blacks. Rates were 6 times greater among enlisted personnel with the lowest ranking compared to officers. And the Army, Navy, and Marines were more likely to report frequent heavy drinking than those in the Air Force. Heavy drinking more likely to occur among younger military members, and significantly elevated rates of heavy drinking amongst women in the military compared with women the same age who are not in the military. And then alcohol misuse also frequently occurred as a substantial proportion of combat veterans. So we see that more frequently with them. And this is why when you're doing some initial screening with a client, you do want to ask them about their military experience. And they may not want to share a lot about it, and that's okay, but you at least want to know if they have any, and then you can know where to screen from there. Post-traumatic stress disorder in the military, often referred to as combat fatigue or shell shock, or historically that's what it was referred to. Beginning with the Vietnam War, more recently with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Department of Defense says that PTSD has been the most commonly diagnosed mental health disorder for veterans returning from combat. And if we, think about all the things we know about trauma, it fits, right? Studies of Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom veterans treated in the in the VA healthcare system found that up to 22% of returning veterans were diagnosed with PTSD. Now, one of the things I always remind people about post-traumatic stress disorder is that most of us from time to time have symptoms of post-traumatic stress. That doesn't necessarily mean we have the actual diagnosable disorder, but the VA is saying up to 22% of our newer veterans are coming back with diagnoses of PTSD. Many, many more are coming back with symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And so something that we definitely need to be screening for. Looking at these details, when we know that someone has a history in the military, we definitely want to be screening for substance use issues. We definitely want to be screening for trauma. So according to the VA, approximately 1/3 of veterans seeking treatment for substance use also had PTSD. So this just fits right in with the co-occurring piece that we're talking about. And 19% also reported having a traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injuries are one of the more significant things we see now with our newer veterans compared to veterans from Vietnam and previous, primarily, again, because we're able to save them. And so they're coming back with alive and functioning, but with some pretty significant brain injuries. And there's a stigma around that too. We're not going to talk about that too much, but let's talk a little bit about the mental health. We're going to see if you can watch this video. Jen, you're going to tell me. I know last time we had some difficulty, so you let me know if this is coming through clearly. This is from a couple of years ago.
U.S. Army pushed to the brink. Of the Army's own report released today. It is a portrait of drug use, suicide, and crime among soldiers, all soaring. The report actually says, quote, "We are often more dangerous to ourselves than the enemy." Arthur Rand has the human cost of what the Army found.
Fading out now. Yeah, we lost the sound now.
What'd you say, Jen?
I said we lost the sound now.
Oh, so now there's no sound at all?
Nope.
I don't know what my issue is with videos. We're going to skip it then. Okay, which is fine because we're running short on time anyway. So when you're dealing with people who have experiences with military, we want to talk about and screen for things like trauma, suicidality, homelessness, and involvement with the criminal justice system. So we definitely want to screen for those things if we know that they have some military history. So according to the VA, about 76,000 veterans experience homelessness on any given night, and about 136 veterans spent at least one night in a shelter during any given year. Which I think is really sad. I mean, it's sad for anybody. Anybody should have to experience that. But you figure our military has made a pretty significant sacrifice for us. But that's sad that they would. That's kind of how we return the favor. Mental and substance use disorders caused more hospitalizations among U.S. troops in 2009 than any other cause. So that tells us that what we're focusing on is significant. And then about 70% of homeless veterans also experience a substance use disorder. So again, you can see the crossover between the different populations we're talking about today. About 50% of returning service members who needed treatment for mental health conditions seek it, but only slightly more than half who receive treatment get adequate care. So if you have 100 soldiers coming back, 50% of them, and they all need treatment, only about 50% of them seek treatment, and only about 50% of them get everything that they need. So of the 325 active duty suicides in 2018, soldiers and Marines took their own lives at the rate of 150% of sailors and airmen. So the Army and the Marines have higher rates of suicide than the Navy and the Air Force. About 44% of military suicides occurred in troops who had no documented behavioral health diagnoses. So that's pretty significant information there. In 2014, the suicide rate amongst men and female veterans and military service members exceeded the national rate for the general population. So suicidality is definitely something we need to be screening for on a regular basis with people who have a history in the military. Veterans comprise about 20% of national suicides. About 22 veterans die every day by suicide. And the rate of suicide for veterans in the LGBTQ plus community is about 7 times higher than the non-LGBTQ plus community. So, you know, again, we're piling on more and more complications as we go along. So military veterans with PTSD reported using alcohol often to cope with some of the characteristics of their trauma, and sometimes not so successfully. So alcohol actually, as we know, can make recovery from trauma worse and can make mental health issues, can kind of exacerbate them. So people who came back from the military with PTSD, who had substance use disorders, tend to relapse quicker if they had trauma than if they were addressing their trauma. There's pre-existing alcohol misuse contributes to post-traumatic psychiatric maladjustment. So in layman's terms, people who are, some of our military folks who are going into the military and already have a pre-existing alcohol or other drug substance use issue are more prone to developing post-traumatic stress. So that's a real important thing to look at. And let's see. PTSD symptoms, but not combat exposure, significantly predicted problematic drinking outcomes. So I think that is an important point to remember here and keep our perspective, is that first of all, we're resilient people. The way we are built, we are hardwired to survive and to make things work and to do well, and we're pretty resilient. So not everybody that's going to experience combat is going to have post-traumatic stress disorder. The brain is wired to process that. It just sometimes takes a little longer. But things like alcohol can stunt that process. And so that's a bigger indicator of whether people are going to get better from PTSD is if they're using alcohol, as opposed to did they experience combat. You know, the one story that I often tell is the gentleman that I worked with who had 2 deployments in Afghanistan. I think he was in Afghanistan. He had 2 deployments somewhere around there. And he was, in his own terms, a paper pusher. So he was in a very safe place. He was not anywhere there where there was active duty. He was not in our country, but he was in a war zone, so to speak, but he was not in combat. He was not in danger. And that's by his own admission that he called himself a paper pusher. However, after 2 deployments, he did develop post-traumatic stress disorder and a lot of symptoms of increased anxiety, mostly focused on the fact that at any moment he could have been called to active duty because of where he was, even though that wasn't his primary job. Had things changed in the climate there, he could have had to go out to the front lines. So that anxiety of this could happen any minute really affected how his brain was working and caused some trauma. Which is why several years ago in the DSM, they changed. We used to say that post-traumatic stress, you had to experience a traumatic event. And now we say that sometimes, you know, the perceived event, it can also cause PTSD. So those are things that are important to take a look at. I think this is a good time for us to take a break. It is 10:25. So when we get back, you know what, I'm going to back up here really quick before we go. So Susan said earlier, I apologize, I didn't see it. She said, my experience with people who are suffering from homelessness and mental health issues is that it's very important for someone to come alongside with and walk with them through the process. It's not enough to tell them what to do and send them on their way. If you cannot help that, make a referral to BCBH or another case management agency early in the process. I think that's really important. Actually, with each of the populations we're talking about today, people dealing with homelessness, military and veterans, people dealing with the criminal justice system, it is important that we walk with them. This is their experience, not ours, right? We're just here to kind of guide them along. But it's their experience, and we're not here to tell them how to live it. We're here to walk with them. I really like how you said that, Susan. So thanks for that. Good, something good for us all to remember about each of these populations we talk about today. So at this point, we're going to take a break. Jen is going to put up a clock. So it's 10:26. I'm going to see you guys back here in 15 minutes. That'll be about 20 till 11. We're going to finish up talking about military and veterans, and then spend some time on dealing with talking about individuals who are dealing with the criminal justice system. That was really, really awesome. All right, hopefully everybody's back. And I got an update from my plumber that says, as I expected, we are not going to have water today. But he'll be back next week, and maybe then we'll have water.
Next week?
Yes. It's a well, now the good thing is we do have a bathroom in the hallway that is working. It's on a separate meter, but none of our bathrooms or water in our suite We don't have any water in here. So we do have a bathroom. We went a week with no water at all. The poor therapists were like really holding their bladders. But then the landlord said, you know, I think that bathroom in the hallway is on a different meter. I'm like, really? Now you tell me? So it turns out it is. So that's good. That
Nothing like you might have water by Valentine's Day.
maybe. We haven't had it since New Year's Eve.
Ugh.
Yeah. Crazy, huh? Well, you know, things happen. Things happen. At least we're not like a surgical center or something. I mean, that would be different. But it was funny when I called, I think I told you this, Jen, but to the rest of you folks here, when I got the water bill, it was 3 times what it usually is. And I was like, what? So I called the water authority and she said, well, have you been doing anything different? And I was like, what, like not coming to the office? Like we're hardly here. And I was like, so why would we use 5 times the amount of water when we're here 50 times less? Doesn't make any sense. So that's when we get a plumber in, and we have some pipe underground that is busted. But there's no basement here. So to get to that is difficult. So problems of the world, right? If that's the worst thing that happens in 2021, I will take it. Okay, so we're getting back to talking about people who have experiences in the military and talking about our veterans. So one of the main characteristics we want to remember about post-traumatic stress has to do with recalling, re-experiencing, having flashbacks and those types of things. And so those indications, those are the biggest indicators of alcohol use, particularly as soon as the first day that someone's back from deployment. So if you have someone who's just recently back, you really want to be screening for alcohol and other drug use, particularly in that first month. Alcohol, other drugs usually are a way to suppress memories, to kind of take me away so I don't have to think about it anymore. And then alcohol can sometimes does reduce some of those nightmares because of the way it suppresses the rapid eye movement during sleep. But remember, when rapid eye movement during sleep is decreased, we don't get good sleep. And when we don't get good sleep, lots of other things don't function well. So we're kind of cutting off the nose to spite the face, but people don't quite realize that. So there's also particularly negative influence that happens for the family members when someone is deployed or someone's in the military. There could be multiple deployments that can really change things, has an impact on the mental health of both the children and the spouses, particularly wives. And children of deployed military personnel have more school, family, and peer-related emotional difficulties compared with people who are compared with civilian folk. So those are things to remember when you're working with children. If they have family members that are deployed, one of my daughter's friends or associates, I would say, she just moved here this school year. I think she moved here in August from Texas. Now they're not a military family; they're a cracker family. I don't know if that's right, but their dad does something with the cracker plant and he moves quite frequently. So they just over Christmas moved again. So they'd moved from Texas to here and they were moving from here to someplace else. And the child, she's a teenager, she said that she was really getting tired of moving. So that's different. That's different because she's not moving because of deployment, but that constant moving can definitely have an impact on kids, and we want to remember that. So when we're dealing with military and veterans, how do we help? First of all, one of the things we want to remember is that there are services through the Veterans Administration. Sometimes they're a little controversial. Sometimes people don't get services quickly or don't get the services that they want quickly. And then people move into the civilian, world, healthcare world, and then they come in contact with us. sometimes people in the military don't want to use veterans benefits because there's some stigma, particularly when it comes to mental health attached there. They don't want the military to know about a diagnosis, and they have a fear, although it should be incorrect, but a fear that if they go through the VA, their diagnoses may be then open to Department of Defense or the military or whoever. And so sometimes they may feel a little more security coming into the private sector for services. Many times they won't feel any security getting treatment at all. And that's something to really, we really have to work on sometimes to help people with. But we want to remember that all the services we offer, Veterans Administration benefits may be an option, but it may be an option that someone doesn't have quick enough access to or doesn't want to utilize. We want to make sure that we're screening early for things like post-traumatic stress. And many times when I've done some assessment about post-traumatic stress for someone who has military experience, they really downplay and even say, we don't need to do that. You know, I'm fine. I know I'm fine. I understand everything. And so it's important that we still do that assessment and some screening about post-traumatic stress early on and do some education with those folks. Look for early signs and do screening about particularly alcohol use, but also other drug use. And it would be good if we could do that before they're exposed to combat, but that's not always a place that we have that opportunity. And then, so post-traumatic stress and substance use are two of the biggest things that we want to be able to screen for if you know someone has a history in the military. We want to look at evidence-based treatments for PTSD that may help reduce the re-experiencing process for them. And we want to look at integrated treatments for PTSD and SUD that approach both disorders at the same time, as we know that that's really, really important. Anyone here? Okay. This is the Veterans Crisis Line in partnership with SAMHSA's National Suicide Prevention Line. So the number here is highlighted. This connects veterans in crisis and their families with people from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's a confidential toll-free hotline, online chat, or text for veterans or their loved ones. And they can get confidential support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Now, remember, a lot of military are not going to want to use something like that because they're going to have concerns about what may happen. Hang on here. I'm sorry. I'm totally losing it, technologically speaking. I'm trying to get back to my chat because someone left a chat, but I can't get that ribbon up top to come down. I'll get there. So one of the ways that we can do that's most helpful, one of the best practices working with military and veterans is called time-limited care coordination. And there's a whole process for that. But basically what we want to do is make sure that there's someone that can walk someone through all the processes that they need and stay with them and be consistent instead of handing them off from person to person to person to person. And this requires sometimes coordination between VA benefit treatment plan programming and non-VA treatment programming to kind of be a liaison between those two. This is time limited, so it's not something long-term, but something to be able to get people engaged and make sure that they stay, that they get engaged and stay engaged. Okay, here's my chat. Okay. This is so cruel. Like that little ribbon comes down and says, you have a new chat. And then when I press on it, it just goes away. And I don't know how to get it. I know I'm being a little whiny, but I do this every time and
It was Paul asking if there was differences, but then he said disregard.
okay, thank you.
What I was,
Okay,
what
I'm
I,
gonna have to
what
take
I
like
was, what I was going to ask was, are there differences in like the assessment or the of a military as opposed to, you know, us getting into services as far as, you know, them not wanting to rely on the military or the VA for services, them getting into the common sector.
Mhm.
Are there differences in like the assessment or something like that because they're in the military?
Well, so so one of the questions, the main screen questions you want to ask is what is their military experience? You do want to know if they've had any combat. You don't need to know specific details of that, but if you have a yes to those two questions, and then you also want to know if they're no longer in the military, what type of discharge they had. That just gives you some guidelines to follow if they had an honorable versus a dishonorable, or a medical. Maybe they had a medical discharge. What was the medical discharge for? So that gives you some clues to move forward. But the reason I moved to the next screen is the PTSD checklist. There's a PTSD checklist for civilians, and there's a PTSD checklist specific to those in the military. So that's one of the things you would want to use the appropriate one. So if you were working with someone who had been in the military, you would want to use that screening tool, that PCL5, that's made specific for veterans and military. And if you're dealing with regular old civilian, then you just can use the regular checklist. So that's where the difference would come in is first of all, asking the question, do you have any experiences in the military? Did you see any combat? And third is what type of discharge? And that gives you some clues of where to go then. If they say yes, if they do have experience in the military, you definitely want to be screening for post-traumatic stress. You definitely want to be screening for substance use right off the bat, even if they've been out for a significant amount of time. And when I say substance use, let's not forget gambling, pathological gambling, gaming, sex addictions, other process addictions too, which there's not as much studies on when we deal with military and veterans about those process addictions. But what we know about the way the brain is designed is, addiction is addiction in some ways. So we want to, if there doesn't seem to be any substance use issues, then we just want to do at least a little minor screening to talk about gambling, to talk about gaming, talk about sex, talk about food, and those types of things. So the other things, some other guidelines when you're working with military veterans, and this should be the same for all the clients we work with, but we definitely want to include them in the shared decision-making process. But particularly when you look at when you're dealing with people who've been in the military, they would see this as a very important thing. It will help develop rapport and respect more quickly if you involve them in the decision-making process about what's going to happen, educate them about the different options, and allow them to make some decisions. Those are important things. And let's see, so we talked about the PCL checklist. That's an important one. That's one of the ones we went over when we did screening and assessment, if you were in that one. There are a couple therapies, trauma-focused psychotherapies that have been shown to really have good success with people in the military and veterans who have PTSD, things like prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. There are some very specific cognitive behavioral therapies for PTSD. There's brief eclectic psychotherapy, narrative exposure therapy, and written narrative exposure. So those are some of the therapies. Now, what I would caution you when you're working with PTSD is some of these type of strategies really need good training to make sure that you're doing them appropriately and correctly, particularly like prolonged exposure. There can be some downsides if you're not doing it correctly. And, we want to do no harm. We want to help people get better. What I can speak to mostly myself would be about EMDR. So myself, I'm trained in EMDR. We have 2 therapists, additional therapists besides myself here in the office who are certified to do, they finished all their training, 80 hours of training and a bunch of hours of supervision to do EMDR. And basically EMDR uses a bilateral stimulus, which basically means something going back and forth. Sometimes we use eye movement, sometimes we use pulses to the hands. Sometimes we use tones to the ears, but to really dig down into the limbic system and kind of process more quickly some of the things that are lodged in there. The limbic system is where trauma gets stuck. And so we can work through that with talk therapy. It can take a long time, and can be a little bit detrimental sometimes, whereas EMDR can be quicker. And the one thing I always like about EMDR is that people don't have to talk about the details of their trauma if they don't want to. You know, back in the day, we used to think that if you, particularly with military, if they had trauma, we wanted them to talk about it over and over and over again until they could talk about the scenario without all the emotion connected to it. And what we've realized over time in studies is that's actually more dangerous. And so what EMDR helps us do is allow people to have a way to help the brain process the trauma without having to relive the experience and go through all those details. And it's a really pretty fascinating process.
Hey, Jill.
So, yes.
Hey, it's Melanie. I have a
Melanie.
question for you. With EMDR in the world that we're living in of completely being technologically based, how effective would you say that the EMDR is doing it virtually versus in person? Has there been any updates to that?
Yeah, so actually, but even before COVID, there were processes in place to do EMDR virtually that weren't really taken a lot of advantage of, but now people are taking advantage of them more and more. And so two of our therapists here, the two therapists besides me, both have done EMDR virtually with good success. Now it takes a little more finessing, as it does with any telehealth, because you have to make sure that the client is really, you're not right there in the same room with the client. So you want to make sure that they can handle the process that you're going to implement. And that can be that can take a little more work up front to make sure that the patient is stable enough to do that. But there's all sorts of things online that can help. Like there's a ball that you can download an app so that it comes on the computer and the client can download it onto their device. And then, when the therapist says, okay, start it now, then they watch the thing go back and forth and their eye movement goes. There's all sorts of ways they've done it, and they had really good success. Now, I have to say, I have not done EMDR virtually. I'm a little skittish. And I've done some of the training, and it's not that I don't believe in it, because I do. But one of the things I've always felt with therapy is if you're not comfortable doing it, then maybe you're not ready to do it. And so there's something about it that just has held me back a little bit. And so I have not done it virtually. But both Jen and Linda here have with good success. And I really admire that they pushed forward with that, because a number of patients, we're in the middle of working on things with EMDR when COVID hit and we had to go virtual. So hopefully does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, actually it does. I was just curious about how the efficacy was, but it's good to hear that even in the virtual world, with a little preparation, that it's still pretty effective and people are still able to tap into that for a good resource.
Absolutely. The other thing about EMDR is, the whole premise, and we don't know why it works. We just know it does work. It's like anesthesia. When I learned that we don't know why anesthesia works, that kind of freaked me out. We just know it does work. Same with EMDR. We don't know all the specific details, but what we do know is that back and forth is very comforting for the brain and allows the brain to process things quickly. It's the same reason why we rock babies when they're when they're crying. We rock them back and forth, and that can be very soothing to them. So people are able to even do some of the EMDR resourcing, which is the first step for kind of the first phase after assessment in the EMDR process. People are able to do some of that resourcing through meditation, by adding some bilateral stimulus, through some guided imagery. They're able to do some of that even on their own. And that's something we've kind of tapped into more since we've gone virtual, and I suspect some of you would say the same thing, is that we're giving clients more tools to use on their own, And then when they come into therapy, they're like, well, I've been using that and this is what's happening. So instead of doing the guided imagery in a therapy session, we're kind of teaching them how to do it on their own more. And I think that's a really good thing. I think that's a really good thing for resilience. It might put us out of business quicker, but I'm okay with that.
So,
Because
quick question.
to help people be able to be more resilient and function better on their own. Okay.
Yeah.
Was there another question?
There's one from me. Could you say what EMDR stands for?
Sure. It's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Okay.
And so the reason it's called that is when the founder, whose name escapes me, Shapiro, when she came up with it, she was really thinking about the eyes and moving the eyes back and forth without moving the head, just moving the eyeballs. What they've learned, so that's how it got its name, with the eye movement. But what we've learned is it's really something, anything that's back and forth. So we use it with taps to the legs or pulses to the hands. With kids, sometimes I put these little pulsers that I have inside their socks. They always think that's fun. So it's, anything that's going back and forth is, even though it started with the eye movement, so that's what we still call it. Anything back and forth helps. And was there another question?
Yes. Paul wants to know the definition of prolonged exposure.
Well, prolonged exposure is a process where you teach someone to, little by little, focus on something more and more significantly. So in some ways we do this in therapy with things that are not so significant. So when we say questions to clients like, well, what's the worst thing that would happen if you did that? Or, think through, think the tape all the way through. When we ask clients question, we're kind of putting them in that process where we're asking them to focus on something uncomfortable for a period of time. When it comes to trauma and we're dealing with prolonged exposure therapy, we're asking people to put themselves in situations that are extremely uncomfortable longer and longer and longer and longer until it does become, until the brain is able to process it. Okay, so we're going to move on.
One question. Do you,
Yes.
I mean, do you deal with the trauma, the actual trauma though? Or do you just deal with, or do you just use like other traumas that would maybe take the place of it? Or
So when you're doing prolonged
do you deal with
exposure
it directly,
therapy,
in other words? That's what I'm saying.
yeah, when you do prolonged therapy exposure, prolonged exposure therapy, then you really do focus on the trauma itself. When you're working with something like EMDR, we don't always focus specifically on the trauma. We focus on the belief that is connected with the trauma. So, for example, young girl I worked with, she was 14. She had Crohn's disease, and she had to take a monthly injection, IV treatment for her Crohn's disease. And she took the treatment twice with no problems. The third time, and now she's in a doctor's office when she gets the therapy, the IV therapy. On the third time, she had an allergic reaction and her throat started to swell up, and she just, all sorts of things happened, and she was fine. They were able to take care of her and everything was fine. But then after that, she said, I can't take the treatment anymore. Like, she was too fearful. She would physically shake when they would on the way to the doctors to get the treatment. So the doctor wanted to switch her to a different treatment, which he had to do anyway because she had developed an allergy to that, where her mom could give her a shot at home, just a quick shot. And even her fear about that was too intense. She couldn't do it. So when we did some EMDR together, she and I, we didn't focus on necessarily what happened when she had that reaction. What we focused on is what it represented. And so what it represented was, she talked about how her throat swelled up. And so when she was trying to tell she said her mom and the nurse were like jibber jabbering, and she was trying to get their attention and she couldn't talk. So like she had this kind of belief that she would lose her voice, her ability to be able to take care of herself. And so that's more what we focus on in things like EMDR, is the belief connected with the trauma, not necessarily the trauma itself. But with prolonged exposure and some of the other cognitive behavioral type things, it really is more focused on the specific trauma. So it just depends. And that's why it's good to know, to have an arsenal of different tools, because sometimes people don't want to talk about the trauma at all. And then you want to find a strategy that you can work with them regarding that. You don't want to force them. This is the only thing I know how to do, so you have to talk about the trauma. You know, we want to have other ways. Sometimes you have people who really do want to focus on the trauma and the incident itself. And so you want to have ways that you can do that when you can. So there's some other therapies that are appropriate. Stress inoculation training, and present-centered therapy, which focuses really on, I always think that's like depression is living in yesterday, anxiety is living in tomorrow, so the best place to live is right here today. Or, you know, sometimes they say in AA, if you're 1 foot in yesterday and 1 foot in tomorrow, you're pissing all over today. Excuse my language. But present-centered therapy really helps people kind of focus on what's going on right now and being more grounded. Some interpersonal psychotherapies. And then there's even some internet, you know, Melanie had asked about EMDR virtually. There are a number of cognitive behavioral therapies that are done virtually. And sometimes they're even done all computer-based. So there's no therapist there at all. The person's able to walk themselves through entirely on their own. So they're studying that more and more. I did go to a conference maybe 5 years ago where a woman was telling us about cognitive behavioral therapy for depression and how eventually we wouldn't need therapists at all anymore because people could just do the therapy themselves. I'm not quite buying that, but but it's an option. And then there's some core values that SAMHSA has said when we're working with military and veteran families. Make sure that they all have access to good behavioral health systems, and to make sure that their services, whether it's civilian, military, or veteran, are all coordinated together. We need to take a look at, you know, the other thing we need to screen for and constantly be on guard for is about suicidality, not just for the military, but for their family members as well. And the housing issue is really important for military and veterans also. So again, you see how these different populations kind of trickle over each other. So a couple things I want to talk about real quick. A couple other treatments when we deal with military and veterans, particularly focused on trauma. There's a large number, and I think I'm going to run through the next couple slides pretty quickly, but there are some statistics about the number of people with marijuana use disorder that are in the military and that are veterans. And that can be a helpful thing for some people, that medical marijuana may be able to help them with some post-traumatic stress. It also can be, for some people, can be detrimental. And so we just need to be kind of wary of that in a non-judgmental way, that if they have medical, and we're talking medical marijuana here, not Bob down the street who, you know, gets his weed from the corner, but medical marijuana as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, many times it can be extremely effective. But for some people, the way the brain is developed and the way the receptors are in the brain, it can actually make trauma worse. And so we just need to be looking for signs of people to see if it's like we would with any other medication. You know, is it helping? Are the benefits more than the risks, or vice versa? They have some new studies where they're looking at LSD to help veterans with PTSD. And the one gentleman said that getting treatment with LSD was like being in therapy while 100 puppies lick you. just thought that was the cutest thing. But there's some really good things coming out of that. And then a ketamine treatment. So ketamine is a hallucinogen, and there's some really good studies coming out to help people with PTSD and with depression with the use of ketamine. So some kind of new agey things that we might not think are gonna happen in our lifetime to help people. This kind of goes through some of the things about how much cannabis use disorder we see. So alcohol use disorder and cannabis use disorder are the two that we see primarily. And so we want to really, particularly in Pennsylvania, where we now have medical marijuana and we may have recreational marijuana at some point, but we don't yet. We want to just be conscientious about what the impact is there. And we want to remember that people who have PTSD and substance use disorder do not need to wait a period of time to be sober before they can have their trauma treatment, that doing those things together usually is the most appropriate. Okay, questions, comments, or thoughts about military, veterans, or military and veteran families? So if we have any veterans here today, I just want to thank you for your service. We're very, very grateful for that. I think it's just something I can't imagine myself doing. And so when I think about people who've put themselves in that position to be willing to do all the things that go with that, I'm extremely grateful and I admire that. So if anybody's out there today that's been in the military, I appreciate it. Okay, so we're going to move on to talk about individuals who are involved in the criminal justice system, and we know that this happens a lot with the populations we work with co-occurring disorders. We're not going to go through the specifics of this graph, but this graph is legit. It's called "What is the sequence of events in the criminal justice system?" So I am a non-co-occurring, pretty functioning, I like to think of myself as a relatively smart person, and I would have a hard time navigating this system. So imagine now people who have depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, trying to navigate through and understand this process. You can understand the stress that comes with it. Talk about a trauma. And I think we need to remember that sometimes the criminal justice system in and of itself can cause additional trauma. It doesn't mean to. It's just the nature of the beast. When we're talking about criminal justice, folks, and mental health, about 64% of jail inmates in our country have a mental health diagnosis, 54% of state prisoners, and 45% of federal prisoners. And you know, those numbers are, I think, probably low. Many people are getting incarcerated and they have not had the ability to have good behavioral health assessment. And so maybe they may be undiagnosed. So offenders in the U.S. Department of Justice survey report a high incidence of drug and alcohol abuse. 1/3 were alcohol dependent, 6 in 10 were under the influence of alcohol or other drugs at the time of the offense. And that's a really important thing to remember when you have someone that comes to you and you're screening and you're going through that initial connection with them, and you ask them about their any experience they have in the criminal justice system, to really find out and look at what caused the criminal behavior. And more than likely, in most cases, it was connected to something other than this is just a bad person. Because of the stigma associated with co-occurring disorders and having a criminal record, so remember, we're layering and layering and layering. This group, this special population has particular barriers when dealing with issues like housing, jobs, finances, and things like that. And there's a bigger stigma. So there's already a stigma we have for people with co-occurring disorders. And now you add someone who has co-occurring and a criminal record, whether it's minor or major. And then we have more stigma. They particularly have difficulty locating treatment programs that recognize and are willing to take them with their particular histories, particularly if you're dealing with people who are sex offenders, people who have histories of arson, people who, you know, have a history, have been convicted of manslaughter. Those things are hard to get them into treatments. They're much more selective who will take them. So how do we help when we're dealing with people who've been in the criminal justice system? Let's just go back here for a second and remember that many of our clients who deal with substance use and mental health issues are going to be involved in the criminal justice system at some level. And what we want to do is keep them out of that system as much as possible, and appropriate, of course, because we want to be able to help rehabilitate them. Now, our system in Beaver County in particular has been much more attentive to trying to look at the cause of specific behaviors and make sure the punishment and the rehabilitation fits the bill. So that's a good thing. But keep that in mind as we're talking about this population. So the overall goal when you're dealing with substance abuse treatment for someone who has, for criminal offenders, is you want to reduce that criminality. And so that if you consider that many people are under the influence when they commit their crime, then you see why dealing with substance use is such an important thing, if that's your goal. Staff who are dealing with people who work in the criminal justice system need to be trained in both mental health and substance use. And our probation here in Beaver County has done a really good job of that over the last years. I don't think we have anybody here today, but the last series that we did, we had probation there all the time. And I know that some of it's because they just wanted to be in training with me. Some of it was really because they just needed training hours and ours were free, and maybe mine were the least painful. But some of it really was that the probation officers really needed and wanted to get some additional understanding so that they could work better with the clients that they're working with. So I think that's a really good thing that Beaver County has been able to focus on. So it's not just business as usual. They're recognizing that there's other things. And in the jail as well, there's tons of programs in the Beaver County Jail to really help people focus on behavioral health and substance use so that they have a better chance when they get out of not committing another crime.
Ben and Steve are both here.
Who's here?
Ben Rader and Steve Cooley.
Oh, nice. There's our jail folks. They take care of things down there. Anything you guys want to add about the services? I don't think they have speakers, actually. They might not have microphones.
I don't think they do.
I don't think they do either. So I could say anything about Steve Cooley right now that I want to, and he could not respond. That makes me laugh. But I will be respectful, of course. Steve's one of my favorite people. Okay, so moving on, treatment services should always be integrated whenever possible. We know that when dealing with individuals with co-occurring disorders to begin with, but particularly when we're dealing with this population, we want to put those services together whenever we can. Make sure that treatment is flexible and individualized. I think that's one of the things that happens sometimes with the criminal justice population is we get kind of focused on this is the list of things we have to do with someone who's involved with the criminal justice, and we forget sometimes to individualize that again, that their involvement with the criminal justice system is not the only thing that identifies them. There's lots of other things there. Everybody has a story. It's why I always joke that I could never work at the jail, because one of my talents is really being able to draw out the story that people have, and then I'd probably, help them all escape from jail. I don't know. I would never do that, but they have a story. So even our worst criminals who have done some of the things that many of us find absolutely we couldn't even imagine, sexual crimes with children and things like that. There's a story behind those perpetrators. And so we want to make sure that treatment is flexible and is individualized for them, and that the treatment is long-term. Now, not necessarily long-term, like you have to come see me every day for the rest of your life, but that there's always some connection for them, so that the treatment is long-term and can really help in the long run. When we're dealing with the criminal justice population, we also should be looking at, and I do think Beaver County does a good job with this, smaller caseloads, shorter and more simplified meetings, special attention to criminal thinking, which is a whole different component, a whole separate component that comes into play. Education about medication, education about substance use disorder, education about mental health issues and co-occurring disorders, and minimizing any impact about confrontation. So we know that people involved in the criminal justice system, you know, that old school way of doing drug and alcohol treatment, which was confrontative, is not always the most effective. So keeping that in mind. We do have some things that we know work, things like therapeutic communities and work release, post-prison therapeutic communities. Lots of cognitive behavioral therapy programs can help with the criminal thinking element. Things like seeking safety. Remember, people have a story. So people who are involved in the criminal justice system more than likely have some sort of history of trauma. And so dealing with programs like seeking safety can help kind of help them build some skills to deal with that. Moral recognition therapy, which really helps people look at their consciousness and connect it with some cognitive behavioral skills, and medication assisted treatment. So one of the things we know pretty significantly is that when the first 2 weeks that someone is released from jail, they have a higher risk. If they went in with opioid use, the first 2 weeks that someone comes out of jail or comes out of treatment or comes out of the hospital, they're at highest risk for overdose and overdose death. And so really helping people get on those medications like a Suboxone or Vivitrol, get them connected to services before they come out can help minimize that. Any way that we could get Narcan into their hands when they, you know, or into the hands of their family members when they're released could be a really helpful thing to save lives. And that takes a lot of education. Now at the Beaver County Jail, they do have a Vivitrol program through BCBH and through Pinnacle, I think is the one who handles that, where people can go through a treatment program there in the jail, and they are able to get their first Vivitrol shot before release. And then they get connected with someone in the community who's going to continue to do their shots from that point on. That gets a little difficult sometimes because people are in and out sometimes quicker than you realize, or their discharge dates come up quick. But I know the jail folks there try really hard to make sure that they get that first shot before discharge. And there's a number of other programs there as well. So some other things to look at with the criminal justice population is to recognize that sometimes they have some special needs, and those need to be attended to clarify what's expected of them in very direct ways. You don't want to be abstract. You don't want to leave room for interpretation. You want to be as clear and respectful as possible. Highly structured activities are good, and ongoing monitoring of symptoms, including, when I say symptoms, you know, substance use, mental health, and criminal thinking, any symptoms of those things. This actually, I thought, would just be interesting for everyone to know. This is the sequential intercept model map for Beaver County. And if you're not familiar with this, many of you probably aren't. I know the jail folks are. We have 6 intercepts that are looked at where we try to intercept people from getting into the criminal justice system or from moving ahead in the criminal justice system. And those start all the way back at intercept 0 with things like crisis, the crisis line, the warm line. These are services over here in the community that we have in Beaver County, the Cornerstone and other housing issues that we talked about, the warm handoff at the hospital. So these are ways that we're trying to get people into treatment and get them services before they get into the criminal justice system, if we can. Intercept 1, there's lots of processes for the different police departments throughout the county to put people in to look at them for a diversion program or to work out some other possibilities depending on the circumstances. Intercept 2 has to do with detention and the initial hearings. Intercept 3 is where, Steve Cooley and our gens are there in the court, in the jails, but as well as having the courts like the Veterans Court and those types of things. And then there's some of our service providers in the area. Intercept 4 has to do with re-entry, which is an important thing to get people back on their feet after they come out of jail. And then Intercept 5 is community corrections and community supports such as probation and parole. And then you can see there's lines where things go back and forth and those kind of things. But I think this shows, and this actually is probably not entirely full. There's probably more services there that didn't get listed. But I think this is a good representation to show you that Beaver County really does recognize that the goal is to help people, not to incarcerate people. Sometimes incarceration is going to be necessary, but that we want to make sure they have the services that they need when we can. Okay. This is a quote that I saw, which is what I wanted to use to wrap up, and then we can attend to any last minute questions, but this really spoke to me. It said, diversity is having a seat at the table, inclusion is having a voice, and belonging is having that voice be heard. And I think when I think about the people that we work with, we want them to have a seat at the table. I constantly, as a therapist, I'm helping people learn how to find their voice. But what we really want too is for that voice to be able to be heard. So I just thought that was, now I have no idea who Liz Foslin is. Maybe I should know who she is, but I really liked her quote. So that's what I used it. So with that, is there anything that we didn't touch on today? Questions, comments, thoughts that anybody wants to share before we wrap up here?
Yes, Jill, it's Paul. I just wanted to ask you, is there anything as far as the criminal justice system goes? Now, I don't remember anything really in the training for a certified peer specialist about the criminal justice system at all.
Mm-hmm.
But is there anything that that you think I should know, that if I do get back into being a peer specialist again, about the criminal justice system and how to care for people that are in that system, along with being, having a mental illness as well as
Sure.
co-occurring as well. Is there anything that you can think of that that can possibly help me, help those type of people? Because I don't know how to deal with that. I mean, mental health, being as though, as a peer specialist, I have a mental health problem myself. So I understand it from that point of view. I've never had co-occurring issues, but the criminal justice system is just another element. And I was just wondering if you had anything to tell me.
Well, I do. So a couple things that come to mind quickly. One is really focus on boundaries. So first of all, the whole role of being a peer has some boundary struggles that we're constantly trying to work through anyway. Because the whole goal of a peer is to be able to share my story to help you with your story, and that crosses over some boundaries and opens some things up. But I think one thing to remember with people in the criminal justice system, let's talk about most severe people who have extreme criminal thinking. Boundaries don't mean much to them. And so what that means is that people that work with them are going to have to continuously set boundaries, reinforce boundaries, reiterate boundaries, and have strong boundaries of their own. And so that's with people, not everybody in the criminal justice system doesn't have boundaries, but if you think of people who have significant criminal thinking, part of criminal thinking is, how do I wear down my opponent? And we are sometimes the opponent. And so having really firm boundaries is really, really important. I think also good supervision You know, I laugh when I say, if, you know, I go to the jail and listen to every story and then want to help them all escape. But, you know, good supervision is what would keep me from doing that, obviously. But there is an empathy that you may feel as a peer, because not everybody in the criminal justice system is deserving of what they're getting, based on the way our system is built at this point. And so if you start to have some empathy for that can be a very therapeutic, something very therapeutic for the process. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you have good supervision, so that, again, you keep those boundaries where they need to be. We have to remember that we're not there to save everybody, you know,
Right.
to guide people. So I think those are some important things. But I think also, you know, I think with most things in life, when you're in positions like yours or a position like mine, you know, when people come in and tell me their story, even if it's something I've never dealt with, there's usually elements to it of commonality that we all have. You know, there's themes in our lives that are all kind of the same. Themes of abandonment, themes of not fitting in, themes of you know, fear. So if you can look at people's story that as they tell them to you, you may not be able to identify exactly, but there's probably elements and themes in there that you can pull from, and that can help you as you work with them. So hopefully that helps some. You know, a number of peer specialists have some criminal behavior, criminal histories of their own, and that can be very helpful when they're working with this population of criminal justice. But it's not necessarily not necessary. But it's kind of like it is kind of a respect thing. Like if you're in the military and you work with someone who's in the military as your therapist or your peer, there's a connection there. There's a credibility that's already exists. If you are in the criminal justice system and you work with a peer who has been through the criminal justice system and survived, then there's an automatic credibility there, which can be very helpful. So hopefully that gives you a little some food for thought there, Paul.
Thank you. I just wanted to say one thing. There was a case where a person had all three issues: the mental health, the co-occurring, and criminal justice system entering that. And just by talking, I guess just by talking to him, I wasn't aware of his criminal thinking, so to say, like you said. And I had to talk, you know, with my coworkers and stuff like that. And they actually explained to me, you know, this is the way they think. You know, they think in terms of what they can get out of a service or whatever, and not generally by, you know, goodwill, using goodwill. But I mean, that was my first kind of like slap in the face, in a sense, saying that, okay, I understand this now, to a certain degree. I mean, I don't understand the total,
Right.
understanding of the way they think, but, you know, but they go about things differently. In other words, that's
Yeah,
what
well,
I'm
and I
trying to
think
say.
this is what's important to remember about criminal thinking is criminal thinking is not just, we're not born with criminal thinking. We are taught criminal thinking based on experiences of our lives. And now those may be experiences very young, and that criminal thinking may have kicked in at a very, very young age, or that may have come later. You know, I think an easy way to look at that is, you know, with the opioid epidemic, you know, you have a number of you know, good white kids who were never a problem, and then they develop a heroin addiction, and then their behaviors totally change. You know, those behaviors that have changed, that criminal thinking, that has been learned through the life of addiction.
Right.
And so I think we have to remember that we need to be on guard for criminal thinking. We need to always have our own boundaries and around people's motivation that we work with. Not from a sense of this is a bad person and he might try to hurt me, but from the sense of this person's history may have made them extremely maladaptive in their skills. And I don't want to be a pawn in that.
Right. Right.
So yeah, and then I like that you said you talked with some of your peers and got some other information, because that can be really helpful to try to figure out, is this really criminal thinking, or is this something that's impacting me because of my own countertransference, or you know, we're complicated people, Paul.
Yeah. Yeah.
So hopefully that helps you a little bit. I want to just
Thank you.
see
Thank
if
you.
there's anybody else who had any questions or any comments.